Hey everybody. There's going to be a couple of lectures today, but in the first lecture, what we're going to do is we're going to look at improving some of the code we wrote last week. So if you remember last week, what we did was we had this JSON that was coming back from a PHP file, and we wrote a program that when we click on the run button, would download it and display it in a kind of list format on the screen. So the first improvement we're going to make is that with last week's code, if we clicked run again, we'd just get the same list duplicated at the bottom, right? Now, that doesn't really make much sense to do. What we'd prefer to do is just refresh the list that's there. How we're going to do that is in our process JSON, which we continuing from last week, we can say container.remove all views. And if you remember what the screen layout looked like, there was the text view, the button, and then a linear layout that was the container. So we're only clearing this bottom container that had the list on it, right? So you'll see if we run it now, we've got our 3 items, and if we run it again, it looks like nothing's happening, but what actually happens is that this piece of code removes all of the items from the list, and then the subsequent for loop adds them back, right? So in essence, we've accomplished nothing there. But the advantage is we don't now have the list duplicating. We're fundamentally refreshing when we click on the run button. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is abstraction. Now, if you remember from our lectures in the first half of the semester, we talked about the concept of abstraction and the idea that when we're working on something, we don't want to think about any irrelevant details or any details we don't specifically need to know. Okay. Now, in the context of this code, whenever we do a PHP request, we're going to have to think about the fact that we're using HTTPS, for instance. We're going to have to think about the fact that we can only run responses or update the user interface from a UI thread. We're going to have to think about making a runnable and reading the response body from an HTTP request. So there's just a lot that we're going to have to think about on every request, right? And if we look at even just the length of this code that does the request and calls process JSON, it's quite long. Now, if we were to do another request, maybe to cars2.php or some other PHP file, what we'd end up doing is copying this entire piece of code and pasting it again. And our class would end up looking really unpleasant. Okay. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at how to create an abstraction or an interface almost that will make it easier for us to use all of this code without having to think about stuff. Now, when we make this abstraction, we have to think about it, right? Because we have to know how the code works. But afterwards, the hope is that it'll make our lives a bit easier. So we're going to put this abstraction in a class. I'm not really sure what to call it. Let's call it PHP request because it's going to be something that requests from PHP. But there's no good reason for that. I'm calling it PHP request pretty much randomly. And what we're going to do is we're going to make a function here called something like do request or something. And we just want it to take over all of this code, like the request that we're doing. We're not going to replace the button and the click listener because we might want to do requests that aren't triggered by a button, or I don't want to restrict us to doing that necessarily. Then there's a couple of problems that are going to come up. One is that we can't say main activity.this.run on UI thread because it's going, I don't have a reference to the current main activity. Okay. So I could send in the main activity like this, main activity A or something, but that would restrict me to doing PHP requests from a main activity. Now, what if I've got an application that has multiple activities? All of them might want to do PHP requests, right? So instead of using a main activity, I'm just going to send an activity. Okay. And then instead of main activity.this, I'm going to say a.run on UI thread because it now doesn't care about main activity. Okay. Another problem is I can see that client is underlined because it doesn't have a reference to the HTTP client. Now I'm just going to move this reference into this PHP request method because I don't need it in the main activity if I'm doing all my requests here. Okay, so now that error has gone away. The next thing that's a barrier to abstraction is this request now will only ever call cars.php. Okay, and that's a bit silly, right? If I want to do it different requests, they'll have different URLs. So what I should do instead is send the URL in. Okay, and that sort of defines which method I'm calling, in this case cars. The last thing that's underlined is this process JSON. It's saying it doesn't know where to get that from. And that's a bit of a more complex one, so I'm going to comment it out for now and I'll come back to it. Now in my main activity, I can then say PHP request maybe equals new PHP request. And I know that I need to send in an activity. No, I don't. I need to send in an activity to the, okay, so there's no constructor in this class, so I don't need to send anything to create it. When I actually do the request, I'm going to say rec.doRequest, and then the activity I'm going to send in is main activity.this, because that's the class that's calling the method. And then the URL I'm going to send in is this, the cars.php, right? And then that means I can delete all of this and I'll be doing the request. Okay. So basically I've moved all of the code from my activity into the PHP request. And that's really useful because I'm going to use this code over and over again. So instead of having to think about all of this nonsense, I just had it directly in my or indirectly in the method by calling it from PHP request. But then I said I was going to come back to the bit about process JSON, because right now it doesn't do anything, right? Right now it'll call the request, fine, but there's nothing displaying, right? Nothing will actually happen because process JSON didn't get invoked. Now, what I really want to do is I would like to do something like a.processJSON, right? But the problem with that is that I can't guarantee that my activity has a process.json method, okay? Because it's just a normal activity. Activities don't necessarily have a process.json. Now you could say I could get around it by changing this back to a main activity, and then we know a main activity has process.json. So if I did that, you'll see the error disappears. But that's not a satisfactory solution because it's requiring me to only ever use main activity here, which means if I have multiple activities, I can't use this request again. So how I get around that is I try to force my my PHP requester to have access to process.json. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make use of something we talked about in the first semester, which was interfaces. Okay, so I'm going to say new interfaces, and what an interface is it's sort of like a contract that forces classes to implement particular methods. Okay, so it doesn't implement anything by itself, but it guarantees, it lets the compiler know that there will certainly be this method, and so you can rely on it being there. So maybe let's make something called request handler. You can call it anything you like. I just called it a request handler. And then we want it to define a method called maybe process response. I'm not calling it process JSON because potentially some of your responses may not be JSON. I don't know, that's up to you. But if we call it process response, it's more generic because we can use it for JSON or we can use it not for JSON. Okay, so then we're going to make it abstract because we don't want to implement it, right? We don't want to say how to process the response because for different PHP requests that we do, we're going to get different responses, and so the process response is going to look different. So when we get here, we now say, okay, we want to take in an activity, a method, but we also want to take in a request handler. RH or something. And then we can say rh.processResponse to response data, right? Now, rh.processResponse, we can guarantee it's going to work because the thing we sent in was a response handler, and so the compiler would force us to define a process response method. Now, if we look at how we instantiated, how we did our request here, we said we have a do request, it sends in our activity and it sends in the method. Now the compiler is basically saying, look, you said you were going to give me a request handler and you're not giving me a request handler. So we put a comma and we say new request handler. Okay. And then we define what we're going to do with the response. So in this case, we're going to call process JSON on the response. Okay. So this code is still a lot simpler than the code we had earlier, right? So it's a lot more understandable to read. You don't have to think about, like I say, you don't have to think about things like that you can only run the response on the UI thread and stuff like that. That's taken care of in the background. As it stands, you don't even have to care that OK HTTP is the library you're using. So let's say at some later date you decide, hey, there's a better thing than OK HTTP. You won't have to change your main activity because your main activity doesn't even know that OK HTTP is being used. You can just go into PHP request and change how you do the call, right? So that's really powerful because it allows you to like upgrade your application as you go with a minimal amount of changes. Okay, because everything's sort of encapsulated. The word is encapsulated, sort of means enclosed inside some other part of code. Now, what will happen is that in every activity you use, you're just going to create a PHP request and call do request. So that means no activity is going to need to know about OK HTTP or about run on UI thread or about any of that stuff, right? Again, it's super helpful because as things change, you don't have to change anything except your PHP request itself. Okay, now the last thing I'm going to do, I mean, this one's a bit optional, but I kind of like it, is this whole URL doesn't need to be sent in every time. What we could do, and again, this is, it's almost a matter of opinion on whether this is useful or not, so you don't really have to do this if you don't want to. But I don't like having to think about what my URL is. I don't like having to think about what my server is. I don't like having to think about whether it's HTTPS. I don't like having to think about what directory the code is in. It's just, I want to get rid of that. So what I do is I move all of that into PHP request as well. But I don't want to restrict my PHP request so that it can only deal with items that come from that string. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a constructor. And that constructor is going to take in the prefix that the URL is going to use. So basically, we're going to send in a string called prefix, and it's going to store it in the global variable URL. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this part of the string and I'm going to put it in here, so that the prefix is defined in the constructor. Okay, then in my PHP request over here, instead of using this method as the entire URL, I'm going to say the URL is actually URL plus method plus .php. Then what it'll allow me to do is that in my actual request, I can just give the name of the PHP file I'm calling, cars. And if you look at what the method will do, it will add on the prefix. So it'll add on this stuff and it'll add on the suffix PHP. Okay, so that didn't work. And since it didn't work, I'm going to have to, oh, it did work. It's just really slow. Okay, cool. So then basically what's happened is I've now got much simpler code over here, but I'm accomplishing the same thing I accomplished before. And this benefit multiplies because for every activity and every request I do subsequently, it's just this part I have to care about, which really is not a lot of code. Okay, cool. So in the next lecture, we're going to look at how to build a system with multiple activities that queries multiple PHP files. So this was sort of preliminary work for doing that. Thank you for listening.